I do believe that I was born with a needle in my mouth. A knitting needle, a crocheting needle, a darning needle, a sewing needle, a embroidery, quilting. Take your pick. I grew up doing all sorts of needlework. There's a picture in my family album of me when I was 5 years old, darning a sock with one of those wooden darning eggs. And in third grade, I was taught to knit in school. Our teacher was Herr Schmuck. He was a male teacher whom we all adored. And in fifth grade, we were taught pull thread embroidery. And this actually survived. This is all in Germany. This survived a trip to this country, and I still have it. I'm still amazed that as a 10-year-old, I was able to do this. After years of knitting and crocheting and cross-stitching, I was introduced to quilting by a dear friend who invited me to help with a raffle quilt project organized by the mothers of the school where I taught, Scribner Road School in Penfield. It didn't take me long to get hooked. From then on, my family and friends all began to get quilty sorts of presents. Unfortunately, I didn't take classes, and my early efforts sure shows it. My first quilt was made in 1983. It was a log cabin quilt made for my mother on Mother's Day. The logs were cut using cardboard templates and using scissors. And by that time I had figured out how to sew those logs together on my trusty Kenmore, but I had no clue about the quilting part. So this one is one of those rare quilts that I machine quilted. If you have ever tried to machine quilt a quilt without pinning it first, you will know what difficulties I had and what a frustrating experience that was. And that's probably why I hand quilt everything now. Okay. I get my inspiration from books and magazines and in nature. I saw the pattern for the next quilt in a calendar. This quilt is called Love Conquers All, and it became my parents' 50th wedding anniversary quilt in 1987. I had a lot of chutzpah because this is applique, and it's one of my earliest quilts, but somehow I knew how to do this without much help from teachers. I guess I learned from books. My mother was there, but for this quilt, she wasn't able to help me anymore, and it was a present for her. So I learned a little bit more about quilting. In this particular case, I learned from Georgia Bonesteel about quilting as you go, and I quilted each one of those squares separately first, and then I sewed them together with the batting and the backing. Each of those heart squares also has my parents' grandchildren and children quilted in it to make it kind of personal. The signature block, I'll show them on the back, the signature block was added years later when I learned that such a detail is really important on quilts. Indeed, elaborate signature blocks have become a trademark of mine, and I'll have them show you some of them on the other quilts. So this quilt has got a lot of spots on it, and it was loved by my mother before she died. My father, as a matter of fact, was the one who told me, "You didn't sign this quilt." And that's when I put the signature block on. Quilting projects crept into my school activities. The next quilt is called 10-gram ABC and was part of a math project with my first graders. The children created the letters of the alphabet they made using the 10-gram blocks that you see around the outside to make their letter. I had cut them out of fabric for them, and they made their letter, and then I glued the letter to a background block, sewed the blocks together, and hand quilted it. This quilt was hung in the school office to the delight of my little ones, who then liked to invent excuses to go to the office so that they could visit it. I made 3 other quilts with my first graders, which live with me now after the fire department declared them too much of a hazard to hang on the school walls. Judy Edwards, my dear friend who got me into teaching, finally thought it was time I should take a lesson. And so she gave me a class with Susie Payne's beginning sampler for my retirement from teaching in 1995. But this was my first class, and I was so nervous about taking this class that I made the entire quilt that she was teaching using her book for practice before the class started. It was a huge mistake because the next quilt, which I then made in the class, was a lot easier to make, and I learned so much from her that it was a good thing. I wish I'd taken the class before. We, of course, cut our templates with scissors, and we used templates even for the quilting part. It was all handy. In those days, a quilt, they told us you need to hand quilt a quilt to be a real quilt. It was actually a scandal in 1989 when Carol Breyer Fowler won Best of Show in Paducah with her machine quilted solar eclipse quilt. It was really unbelievable. But by now I was becoming confident. I made my own version of a sampler quilt that I'd seen in Quilter's newsletter, and it is called Quilt Primer, and it celebrated this school teacher turned quilter life. Quilt Primer has turned out to be a teaching quilt on a few occasions when I gave presentations about various quilt patterns. It also is a quilt that is a favorite quilt in my guest bedroom. So that's Quilt Primer. In the year 2000, I saw a rotary purse buttonhole stitched quilt by Anita Shackelford right here in Schweinfurth. And I loved it, and I remembered it. And I used the buttonhole stitch technique in the next quilt. So, it's called Winter Botanical. It is a pattern that I used, but I love the buttonhole stitch part. And I attached the flowers with buttonholes. However, the buttonholes did not live up to Anita Shackelford's standards, but not a problem. I love this quilt. It's hanging in my living room, and it's been there ever since. So that's Winter Botanical. So then I started experimenting a little with making miniature blocks, or little blocks. So the next quilt is called My Little Table Cover. Sewing accurately on such a small scale was a challenge. I used that piece for years as a cover for my cardboard coffee table. The cardboard box for my coffee table was a speaker box that I'd bought the speaker in. I used it for years as a coffee table, and it looked great with that little quilt on top. It's amazing how quilting can help you make do. In 1996, I was fortunate enough to be invited into a beloved mini quilt group of 5 like-minded quilters. We called each other the quintessential quilters. There were 5 of us. And we met once a month at each other's houses, sharing quilt stories and eating. Not necessarily in that order. I was so enamored with those little blocks, the little 4-inch blocks that I'd made, to construct like a little table cover that I suggested we, quintessential quilters, should make 5-inch, 4-inch blocks, which we did. And we each made 4-inch blocks for the 5 of us every month. And by the 12th month, after a year, each of us got 60 4-inch blocks. And the arrangement of those 4-inch blocks and the quilting was left up to us. And this is what I came up with. The setting of the blocks came not from my brain, but from a book called Quick Quilts from the Heart by Liz Porter and Marianne Fons. Now, I have to confess to you that I quilt without a hoop. I never learned how to use a hoop to quilt. I never learned how to do anything from anybody, from any teachers except Susie Payne. And so quilting this quilt was hard because there are all these circles, you know. So what I do usually is just baste the quilt very well, with help, and then start in the center of the quilt and then quilt outwards. For the circles, that's a little hard to do. So I did buy a hoop and I tried it, and I was getting really frustrated and I gave up. And like, I guess it's okay, but you can't teach an old dog new tricks. After my retirement from teaching, I was privileged to work for a not-for-profit organization called Young Audiences. The mission of Young Audiences was to make the arts an integral part of student learning. We had artists on our roster, visual artists, literary artists, theater artists, and made them available for classes and workshops and residencies in the schools. The artists were paid in various ways by the schools, but our office space and the staff were paid with donations. So one source of income for the staff was an annual gala entitled Kaleidoscope, a Celebration of the Arts. And I made 2 of the following quilts for auction at these events. The first one is called Pieces of 8 Leitmotif. It is inspired by the work of Paula Nadelstern, but it's an original design of my own, using a myriad of mirror image fabrics. When I first made this quilt, I just had the large kaleidoscopes on there, and when I sewed it together, all those little empty spaces where it was sewn together were kind of empty. So I applied smaller kaleidoscopes into those empty spaces. Show them the signature block of that one too. It was bid upon and won by good friends of mine named Betsy and John Carver. It hangs in their house, and they let me borrow it back for this event. So thanks, Betsy and John. That's one year. The next year, they had a kaleidoscope event where the next quilt was auctioned off. And this quilt is called Rose Window for the Arts. And it's a pattern that I interpreted by Angela Beasley, who replicated in cloth the creation window in our National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. I had a ball finding fabrics, unique fabrics, to make this quilt just glow. It belongs to Jan Harper and hangs in Jan Harper's daughter's house, and I thank Jan and Erica for letting me borrow it back. When I became socially secure, I retired from Young Audiences, and then I joined Genesee Valley Quilt Club. Now I really spend serious time quilting. In the fall of 2006, I took a class in precision machine piecing from a master quilter, Sally Collins. So at that time, I became ill with a muscle disorder, and I couldn't really access my basement studio. So my dear friend Tony Foster went down there to pull fabrics for me. She copied patterns for me, she taught me how to hand piece. So this was a machine piecing class, but then I ended up hand piecing this entire frame, this entire piece. The result was homage. Homage is a first for me as far as hand piecing is concerned. Homage is a tribute to all the wonderful and talented people who helped me with its creation. I gave homage to Isaiah House, a hospice home in Rochester, to hang in the room where my dying sister was so lovingly taken care of. I made several quilts for Isaiah House, including the next one, which is called Oh Say Can You See? This is a flag quilt, and it honors all the veterans who have died in Isaiah House. Their names are written on stripes, and this quilt I didn't hand quilt. It was spectacularly long-arm quilted by Teddy Ahorn in Rochester. Thanks to the executive director of Isaiah House, Christine Wickert, for letting me borrow back the two quilts that I showed you. One of my gurus is Ginny Beyer. I love Ginny Beyer's border prints and her blending of colors. So the next quilt is called Monticello Baskets. It is inspired by a Ginny Beyer fabric line called Monticello. When I finished all those baskets, I knew that I had nothing to hand quilt anymore. I had nothing ready, I hadn't done anything else. So usually I piece during the day or applique during the day, at night I quilted. So I had nothing, so I decided to stuff this quilt. So how did I do this? I threaded a darning needle or a longer trapunto needle with 4-ply acrylic yarn, and I fed it repeatedly from the backside between the layers of the fabric to stuff the designs. If you turn it around, you will see the stuffing much better. So now it is a two-sided quilt. The front is pieced, and the back looks like a whole cloth quilt. It is very heavy and very dense. It did not hang very straight after I stuffed it, so I pulled a piece of thread through the binding just to make sure that the two sides were exactly the same length, and it worked. But from then on, it was shown on the white side. It had to make up an award for this at in the Vermont Festival. It won Best Two-Sided Quilt. And they actually hung it on where you could see up both sides. The next quilt, Celebration, was also inspired by a Ginny Beyer border print. And that border print inspired the colors of the shells that are in this. The quilt design actually came from an antique quilt shown in Kay Fassett's book, Museum Quilts. And if you look carefully at the layout of each shell block, you will see a definite order in the way the shells were arranged. This quilt is on my bed at the moment. It fits perfectly in the Zen theme of my bedroom. So, I like figures that sort of reflect what the quilt is all about. The next one is called Hexed. I was compelled to join the multitude of quilters who sew together hexes using the English paper piecing method. The design of Hex is by Kim McLean. It's not my design, but it's hers, and I loved it. And I was indeed hexed for a whole year, sewing all those wonderful fabrics together and then quilting it. This quilt is also so heavy, it's not practical. You don't want to sleep on it. And if this quilt isn't practical, you want to look at it. You want to see where the designs repeat themselves. But if this quilt isn't practical, the next one is even less practical. But it's got a wonderful name. It's called More is Better. So More is Better was started ages ago using my extensive collection of William Morris fabrics. I used a pattern for this one that I saw in a book called A Bouquet of Quilts. However, sewing all those 1/4-inch log cabin blocks together after a while was just too tedious, and I gave it up. It became a UFO until the pandemic. I pulled it out, and lo and behold, I finished it. Yay! And it actually was a favorite of one of the judges in the 2020 Genesee Valley Quilt Club. She liked it the best. It is so heavy that if you want to sleep under it, you wouldn't survive the night. It would smother you. It's because it's double, all those seam allowances, it's just double. All right, that is Morris better. By now, I had fallen in love with silk, working with silk. My friend Cindy Lowenguth retired from Scribner Road School, and she got the next quilt called Flowering Urn. Flowering Urn was made with Dupioni silk. It's a pattern by Rosemary Mackin from her book called Floral Abundance. But the border was a silk brocade drapery fabric that I found at Calico Corners. Check out the signature block on this one. I just borrowed this back from Cindy. I had forgotten about the block. This was in 2000, long time ago. I made tiny blocks like that. I thought that was just recent, but yeah. So anyway, that's the first, one of the earliest silk quilts. One February, on my way down to Hilton Head, I visited Mary Jo's cloth store in Gastonia, North Carolina. Anybody ever been there?
I've been there.
Oh my God, when I got there, the first thing I looked at in those days was bolts and bolts and bolts of Dupioni silk. I was entranced. I think they just happened to show all their bridal fabrics first that time. So I was just entranced. So when I got home, I had a project in mind for those silks. One phone call, and I was on my way to the start of a silk stash. Since then, I have shopped in New York City, in the Garment District, at quilt shows, and of course online to build my stash. People give me old ties, they give me their old clothes, and I get samples from home dec places that go out of business. And what a joyful place I have now to create. This quilt, Bijou Soie, was created in 2006. It was started in a piecing class. There was 6-inch blocks. But then I discovered that piecing with silk, unless you interface it, which these aren't, is pretty difficult because it's slippery and it does ravel in one direction. So I decided I would piece half the blocks and applicate the other blocks. And that made it a little bit easier. The border was a Karen K. Buckley design that I saw in Quilter's newsletter, and I just copied it in silk. It's the only silk quilt that I have that is backed with cotton. And it's also one of the earliest quilts where I put scallops around it. Scallops kind of became a signature. It lives on my way down to my studio, so no light has hit it since it's hung there, so that's great. The next one is called Médaillon Soyeux. It was started in 2009 when the pattern by Sue Garman was offered as a Block of the Month program on the quilt show online. This quilt was all paper piece, but I liked the pattern so much that I have forgotten how hard it was to piece with silk. But after a while, it was just too hard. I gave up. I just put it aside. It became another UFO. Fast forward to 20, pandemic, and by then I had learned a little bit. I learned a little bit about how to piece with quilt, with silk. In the pandemic, I had to stick to it. I couldn't go anywhere. I was German and stubborn, and I finished it. On the back is a wonderful green dupioni silk given to me by my friend Pat Polly. Pat, I don't know, I think she bought the silk to make curtains and then she didn't like it. It was fabulous. The signature was made by my sister on her embroidery machine. And to be honest, I like the back better than the front. Almost better than the front. This quilt is 80 by something. It is very large, but very light. You could drape that around your shoulder because it has silk batting. And silk batting is just so drapey. It's my nap quilt. It sits on my couch in my living room and I take a nap under it. Very, very warm. Silk is very warm. And in the summer it's very cool. So it's a wonderful nap quilt. From then on I made mostly applique quilts in silk. Like the next one called So Sampling the Silk Road is a pattern by Edita Sitar. The border is my design using her passage, her things. It is not only a sampler of applique patterns, but a sampler of background quilting patterns. So there are a different background quilting pattern in every one of those blocks. The beading was added after I discovered that when my binding wasn't quite filled with stuffing, and the judges would touch the binding and say, it's not quite filled with batting, and say, okay, this is not going to win anything. I sewed bugle beads around the outside. And so if they touched that, and they did discover it. This quilt won Best of Show in Lancaster at the AQS show. So it gave me the confidence to make more complicated silk quilts, like the next one. So this one is my version of a Persian. One night I woke up and I looked at my oriental rug in my bedroom and I said, this is like a quilt. So I went downstairs and I pulled out Deborah Campbell's designs and I arranged them on paper into this pattern, into this design. Deborah Campbell is a fabulous designer. I love every minute of doing this Persian quilt. It is all silk. The batting is silk, the backing is silk. It was a joy to make, and it won quite a few awards. But it was just luscious for me to make. I loved making it. Deborah Campbell has become a personal friend of mine, and she has moved on from quilting. She's not doing that anymore, but I'm still inspired by her wonderful designs. She once taught an online class called Garlands and Hearts and Flowers. Oh my. I had to buy a fabric pack, but my background fabric and my backing fabric was my own. And she taught us this class online, so every month I was waiting for the directions and the pattern, and within 2 days I had it done. And then I waited for 28 more days for the next pattern. I love doing this thing. But this one is cotton. She finished making the class. She made, of course, her own version. And she said that to all of her students, please, don't show your quilt in a show until I show mine. So we just, as it should be, the teacher should be able to show her own first. She said, Christine, if you would like to make this quilt in a miniature version, you can show the miniature. Well, I wasn't gonna, so I took her up on the challenge, and I did. So the next one is, oh my gosh. I didn't know what I was getting myself into. It was hard. That's all I'll say. And I won't even say I love making it, because I learned a lot about making it. One of the things I learned is that when you make a miniature of something, everything has to be miniature. Your quilting stitches have to be miniature too. Your beads that you put in it have to be, sometimes it's really hard to find, really teensy tiny. So I had to pay attention to a lot of this. I also over quilted it. It did not hang straight for a while. I had to really beat it into submission. It's now in my basement, in my studio. Anyway, so that is the second time I made this pattern. I love this pattern so much, I made it again. This time I made it into a red and white quilt. So the red and white is of course the color of 40th anniversary. This celebrates the 40th year of quilting, so I've been quilting for 40 years. And this is also a stuffed quilt, and the reason I had to stuff this quilt was because it was too late when I discovered that the red shadowed through the white when I applicated, and no way was this ever going to pass luster in the show. So I decided to just snip a little bit into the red silk in the back, a little snip, took a toothpick and pushed stuffing into all those tiny little details. You can imagine how long it took to, but I love this quilt because and actually in the long run, it made the quilt better. It is now a beautiful applique quilt stuffed. Okay, the next quilt. This is called Bouti Botte. And show that on the pink side first. Because Bouti Botte is how many of you are familiar with Bouti quilts? Bouti was a quilt method in Marseille during the 18th century, 1700s in Marseille. They produced these for sale in those days. And what you did was you created a pattern, quilted it all on usually white cloth, cotton cloth usually, in Marseille. And then you took a trapunto needle, filled with yarn, and they usually used cotton yarn, and they fed it through the channels of the quilting to give it a raised effect. And that's what Bouti Botte is. I quilted the whole thing on silk this time. I had to find a silk that was not as densely woven as normal silks are, and I did on the pink side. Quilted it first, stuffed it from the pink side, and the white side is the front of the quilt. I didn't want to put a label on this quilt. I embroidered the label on this one, on the bottom of the quilt, because it would distract from the whole cloth effect of this quilt. I also had a hard time making this hang straight because it's stuffed and quilted so much. You'll see doesn't hang quite straight. The scallop border was actually applied separately, and so the quilt was done, and then I had to create the border for it, and it was already quilted. So I had forgotten how much fabric was lost in the quilting, so I had to estimate how much fabric I would need for the border design, for the scallop border, and I estimated wrong, and I made one border, and it was too short. So I'd chuck it. Start again. This gave me an idea of how much longer I had to make it. So I don't know what to do with this. Completely stuffed and ready to go. The next quilt is called Sewing is Reliefing, and you'll find out why it's called Sewing is Reliefing. It is actually inspired by a 102-inch applique quilt that I saw pictured in Keith Fass's book entitled Bold Blooms. This was 102 inches. When I did this, I reduced it. I put sashing in it, which Keith didn't do in his. I don't know why I wanted to put sashing in it, but anyway, I put it on the design wall, and I did not like it. It looked like soldiers lined up in a row. And there it sat for a couple months, waiting for an inspiration to fix it, and it finally came to me. I took some of those leaves that are in the border vases there, and I just scattered it all over the quilt. And that unified the whole quilt, first of all. And then I quilted the quilt, ignoring all the sashings in a circles around the blocks. That helped. Then I put the scallop border on the outside, and then I put the finishing touch on that. Then I really liked it. The only thing that was missing was the name. What should I call it? So there is a fabric in this quilt cut from an old silk robe that my mother had. My mother, being unable to pronounce, had a hard time pronouncing things like, I really can't believe this. We called it sewing is belief. The last quilt I'm going to show you is called Betsy's Blanket. One day my friend Betsy called me to ask if I could use her grandmother's satin ribbons that she had found in the basement while she was cleaning it out. Of course I took them. One roll was all pink, and it looked like pink satin. I had been eyeing a design in Irene Blank's book that this pink ribbon would be perfect for. What a ball I had making that quilt. Not only because I knew it was going to go to Betsy. First of all, I loved Irene Blank's design, but it needed more. It needed bugs and butterflies and embroidery. And so I went to town in just enhancing it with all kinds of embellishment. I happened to have the backing fabric in my stash, which was absolutely perfect for this quilt. I mean, who knew that something like this would live in my house and waited for this quilt to happen? I have to say that this quilting passion does keep my brain ticking. It's great for my aging body and soul, but I learn something from every project that I tackle. But best of all, it keeps me in contact with you all, with my friends, and with my folks, and with my family, and with the world.